Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. We might have some more attendees joining us, but thank you all and welcome to our talk today. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Meredith Lehman, and I am the head of education at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University in St. Louis. Our talk today is organized as part of the New Perspectives series, which spotlights emerging scholars in the Department of Art History and Archaeology in Arts and Sciences. The talks focus on one or more works from the museum's collection and align with the speaker's expertise and scholarly interests. And today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Lacy Murphy. Lacy is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and Archaeology. She holds a BA in French from Truman State University and an MA in Art History from Washington University in St. Louis. She specializes in 19th and 20th century European and American modern art, and her research interests include histories of colonialism, visual culture, documentary photography, queer theory, feminist theory, Marxism, disability studies, and museum studies. Her dissertation seeks to describe how the changing political, social, economic, and cultural terrain of the 20th century transformed the visual strategies of the French colonial empire. Lacy's talk today, Memory and Resistance, Charles Meryon's Paris on the Eve of Transformation, will examine the French printmaker's etchings of 19th century Paris on the eve of a massive urban renewal project. A couple of technical notes before we begin. We hope that you will participate in the conversation by sharing questions during the hour using the Q&A feature. And this is located on most devices at the bottom of the screen. There will also be time at the end of Lacy's talk to answer questions, so you can save them for the end too. Captions are also available if you click live transcript. Again, on most devices, this is located at the bottom of your screen. You click live transcript, and that way you can access our captions. A recording of today's talk will be available on our YouTube channel sometime next week, and we can share the link in the Q&A with everyone. With that, I will hand it over to Lacy to get us started.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm unmuted because I've done that so many times where I think I'm unmuted and I'm not. So hopefully everyone can hear me. Today I'm going to be telling you about the life and work of 19th century French printmaker Charles Meryon. And I thought it was rather fitting this morning. I got up and got ready to take my dogs out, and it was raining and it just felt dreary, and I felt like I was in Paris once again. So we'll be focusing on these etchings, which are all of Parisian scenes, and were published in a compendium of 25 scenes, sometimes just 12 of the city. And Meryon completed these between 1850 and 1854. A few of the prints that I'm going to look at today reside in the Kemper's collection as well. So we're very lucky to have them. Okay. So here we have them in French. It's Eau Forte sur Paris. Our artist, of course, Charles Meryon. On the leftmost side of the screen, we have the front plate, the frontispiece that was located at the front of the compendium of prints that were sold. Meryon is by no means a household name, at least nowadays, but in his time, he was truly beloved by cultural giants of the 19th century that you might recognize, such as Charles Baudelaire and Victor Hugo. Baudelaire was very impressed with Meryon's work, and he even offered to provide textual accompaniments to these prints, although that project was never realized. Meryon has received limited attention from today's scholars, but was celebrated and well known as a printmaker during his time, and he received a lot of critical engagement and praise, although his career really was rather short. Unfortunately, much of the attention that he received, both in the past and recently, has been largely related to his mental health, which I will discuss at greater length shortly. But first, I wanted to offer a content warning before delving into Meryon's background. Today, I will be addressing themes such as mental illness, self-harm, and suicide. And these themes will come up mostly just in the beginning of the lecture. So please take care if these matters are triggering for you. And I just wanted to also restate that the talk will be recorded and made accessible through video. So if you would prefer to view the lecture in private, once you've had the time to prepare yourself emotionally beforehand, you'll be able to do so. Meryon's prolific career and artistic contributions have often been eclipsed by his struggles with mental illness, creating a sort of mythology about his life that can really limit our ability to understand his work in its historical context. Between 1858 and 1859, Meryon spent 14 months in an asylum after years of experiencing paranoia and depression, which was really intense for him and disrupted his work. These are the years just after his most productive period of time as an artist and the time frame during which he produced his famous series of etchings on the city of Paris, which we will be looking at today. Meryon's physical and mental condition on the eve of his institutionalization was captured by his friend Leopold Fleming in this print from 1858. In the print, Meryon is shown bedridden and in a disheveled state. The room is dark and claustrophobic, and Meryon wears a somewhat confused and somewhat blank expression, as if awakening from a strange dream. The shadow behind him is especially of note, as if an expression of his true mental state. The shadow is menacing and is meant to express Meryon's interior experience. In 1866, he returned to the asylum where he died after refusing to eat or drink. Contemporary sources report that at the time of his death, he believed that he was Jesus Christ. Because of his mental health, his works have often been read as a byproduct of what one author called his tortured sensibility. And this was an author of our contemporary times. And because of this, a lot of his works are often thought of as more of a mindscape than a cityscape. In this lecture, however, I intend to table his mental health and focus on his class experience, which I contend played a key role in both his choice of subject and stylistic approach. And through this process, I'm hoping to demonstrate that Meryon's etching of Paris were both a way for him to record his life's experience, and that these etchings ultimately serve as an act of resistance on the eve of a vast public works program that drastically transformed the city's built environment, especially the environments in which he came of age. So let's start with his background. Meryon was the son of Narcisse Chassepoux, a dancer at the Paris Opera, and Dr. Charles Louis Meryon, Anglophonized there. He was an English doctor, Meryon, our artist, was named after him. Chassepoux raised Meryon in Paris with reportedly very little help from the doctor, who was physically absent throughout Meryon's life, although I think they did meet a few times. But mostly the two eventually did come to correspond regularly after Meryon found out about the details of his birth. He didn't find out about these details until he was 16 or so. Meryon recollected numerous times that the revelation of his parentage was quite a shock for him. He really resented that his social standing was affected by this. And writing to his dad in 1840, he offered the following reflection on his life. Quote, "I was born to be unhappy, always to blush because of my illegitimate birth. We have no connection in society's eyes. I have no name." As illustrated by Meryon's own writing, his experience of his class greatly troubled him and cast a shadow over his life. Meryon developed and really nurtured a sense of self-loathing during his adulthood, which is demonstrated through this portrait etched years later by friend and artist Félix Braquemont in 1853. Meryon himself insisted on adding the inscription at the bottom, which read, quote, "The grotesque visage of the somber Meryon." But it wasn't his relationship with his dad that created the only difficulty in his life, although his status as illegitimate certainly compounded his experience. From all accounts of his childhood, his mother doted heavily on him. He wasn't an only child. He did have a sister. However, his father reportedly provided very little financial support during his childhood. And with his mother's profession as a dancer, a profession that would not have only been stigmatized, but would not have exactly been very lucrative, it's more likely that Meryon grew up in an impoverished working class neighborhood and situation. So what would this have been like for him? Meryon was born in 1821 in the midst of the Bourbon Restoration, a period during which time the French monarchy returned to power, and along with it, a conservative political and social system that was derived from the pre-revolutionary days of the Ancien Régime. A few years after Meryon was born, and during the most formative years of his life, Charles X became the ruling monarch in France. And Charles X was an ultra-royalist. He cracked down on some of the more progressive legislation that had been introduced during the preceding years, and he especially sought to restrict the press and increase the power of the nobility. France also saw an economic downturn during Charles X's reign, and these years of agricultural and industrial hardship were worse than the country had really ever faced before. In the years between 1827 and 1832, during which time Charles X abdicated and his son Louis Philippe became the leader of the constitutional monarchy known as the July Monarchy, France suffered an unusually long run of consistently bad harvests, more sustained even than the crises which preceded the 1789 revolution. And due to these tough times, many rural French citizens immigrated to the city in search of work, causing the city's population to soar and forcing the city to expand to accommodate its new population. And these were the difficult years, as a cultural reference, by the way, which Victor Hugo wrote about in his celebrated text, Les Miserables. So throughout these years, Paris became increasingly industrialized with this influx of workers. And the textile industry was an especially important part of the economy, along with the manufacture of other goods and chemicals like rubber, aluminum, and chlorine. The working class, of which Meryon would have been a part, was easily the largest social class in Paris at this time. And these years were not particularly kind to workers either. The economy and political system was such that upward mobility was very difficult for anyone below sort of the upper middle class echelon. Life in Paris for the working class was essentially a shared traumatic experience of marginalization, oppression, poverty, and suffering. Not only was life full of hardship, but the poor was considered part of or what was referred to at the time as les classes dangereuses, or the dangerous classes, by the middle and upper class. The ever-increasing crime, violence, social problems, and civil unrest that accompanied poverty in the city were deemed a result of the moral failure of the poor. And the government and ruling class didn't really consider that industrialization and a commodity-based economy, capitalism, were connected in any ways to these social problems. The poor were really considered the agents of their own misfortune, and as such, very little effort was made to improve the living conditions of the working poor. And these were the conditions in which Meryon likely grew up. Here we pick up with Meryon at the age of 16 in 1837, with his social standing greatly lowered due to his illegitimacy. There were a few ways for Meryon to rise up in society. So he decided to join the Navy, which would have offered him a more respectable position and financial stability. He entered naval school in Brest, where he was first introduced to drawing. And there is where he started to learn to make sketches of coastlines and landscapes. During his career with the Navy, he was able to travel all over. He especially was able to travel all over the Mediterranean. He went to Algeria, Tunisia, Turkey, Greece. And as we're about to see in these drawings, he even made his way to New Zealand and Tahiti. Some of the sketches he made in Oceania are seen here. As can be observed, Meryon had a really keen eye for detail. The line of these drawings are extremely precise, and he's given considerable attention to perspective and dimension. And these early drawings start to demonstrate Meryon's adept skill at still what would have been a very early age in his early 20s. Meryon returned to Paris on leave from the Navy in 1846, just a couple of years before the Revolution of 1848, which established the Second French Republic. And in these years before the revolution, Meryon was able to devote himself fully to the study of art. He received a classical or academic artistic training from a minor pupil of famed neoclassical French artist, Jacques-Louis David. So he was really trained in an academic sense. And this was a really peaceful time for him. On leave from the Navy, he spent most of his time in museums studying art and completing drawing exercises, all of which were extremely conventional parts of academic artistic training at the time. At this time, Meryon was living on the left bank, close to working class neighborhoods where barricades were thrown up by citizens as tensions boiled over in 1848. The photograph on the right shows you what these barricades look like. Once again, if you think back to Victor Hugo and Les Miserables, if you've seen that movie, the barricades also show up there. The nearest barricade to Meryon is marked on the map here with that red dot. And the approximate location of where Meryon was living is marked in yellow. Since Meryon was still enrolled in the military, although on leave, he served in the National Guard and was deployed in a pro-military militia, during which time he was embroiled in the tensions of this revolution. And he saw revolutionary battle firsthand and even sustained some minor injuries. But after the revolution, he relinquished his post to practice art full-time, citing a lack of confidence in his military skills. But I wonder as well if he might have felt conflicted about having fought against members of his own class. So it's within this context that I situate Meryon's series of etchings on Paris, which he began in 1850, just 2 years after he took part in the events of the Revolution of 1848. And I contend that Meryon's working class experience throughout the Bourbon Restoration, July Monarchy, and Revolution of 1848 informed his etching series on the city of Paris. But before we get into the prints themselves, I want to tell you a little bit more about Meryon's relationship to printmaking and the process of etching. First, it's important to know that Meryon worked in printmaking because he was congenitally colorblind. He knew from an early age that his perception of color differed from those around him. And it wasn't really, however, until he was studying as an artist that his situation really, I think, started to dawn on him that this would affect his art making. But this really was no loss to Meryon. He had always recalled that he had preferred the black and white composition of a print with its subtle gradations. He could just see it better. And since he had difficulty with color, color had always been secondary to him anyways. And furthermore, this wasn't a death blow to his artistic career. Printmaking was not considered a secondary art form at this time. There was a rebirth of interest in printmaking in the 19th century, and it was really considered an art within its own right. During the 19th century, many artists utilized printmaking as an important medium that they could use both to satisfy their creative impulses, but also to help propel their careers forward so they could circulate their work more broadly. Thus, there was really no hard feelings for Meryon, although his impaired vision was ultimately what guided him towards printmaking. The etching process, as we are about to see, involves the incision of lines onto a polished metal plate made from iron, copper, or zinc. The plate is first coated, as you'll see here, with a layer of acid-resistant varnish or wax. And then the artist carves their design directly onto the print using a stylus or some sort of etching tool. Then the plate is then placed in an acid bath, and this acid reacts only to the lines that have been incised on the plate, eroding it. So you can see this taking place in our acid bath. Then that plate is removed and cleaned with a solvent as seen here to remove that varnish. Next, the ink is added to the plate and excess ink is removed from the plate so that the only remaining ink is in those etched lines. Finally, before the plate is moved to the press, it's covered with a sheet of dampened paper that will absorb the ink more readily. And then a printing blanket is added on top of that to reduce the pressure of the press on the metal plate, as can be seen here. So as is observed on this right-hand side, that image on the right, line and precision is incredibly important to the printmaking process. And we know that these were skills that he had started to develop when he was doing these sketches in Oceania of shorelines and landscapes. So we know he certainly had the ability to perceive and record nuanced detail. Meryon often created sketches of his subject prior to etching his plate, and it was not uncommon for him to continue to add details to a plate over time. Artists did this regularly, producing what we call different states of the same plate. Meryon created 25 etchings of Paris, many of which pictured the same structures from different perspectives. It's mostly organized around the Notre Dame de Paris, but because of that, we often see Conciergerie, the Pont Neuf, Pont au Change, and other bridges from, once again, multiple perspectives. So the same features appear several times. So as you can see on this map, even though we have less than 25 red dots, which show you kind of approximately where these structures were. He did the Notre Dame several times from inside the Notre Dame and from outside the Notre Dame. So I've charted these locations to the best of my ability on the map in red. And then the yellow point seen southbound from these red points is where Meryon was living while he worked on this series. But as you probably noticed, all of these red dots are condensed in one area on the Île de la Cité, which was the naturally occurring island, one of two on the River Seine. The furthest point from Meryon's apartment was the Pont Neuf, which was about 1.5 kilometers away, or about a 20-minute walk. I replicated this walk a couple summers ago when I happened to be in Paris out of curiosity. It took me about 20 minutes. I also was able to walk from location to location in each of his prints. And as you can see on the map, they're very close together. And so Meryon would really have only needed a few minutes to walk from each site to the next. Meryon's focus on the Île de la Cité certainly seems to suggest that he believed these river islands to be the seat of Parisian identity. And this makes sense historically speaking, since the history of the Île de la Cité dates back to the Roman times. And crucial to this series especially was the location of the Gothic founding of the city as well. So from Meryon's perspective in the 19th century, during which time there was a revival in all things Gothic, this was also a strategic choice and a selling point for his series. By the 1850s, when Meryon started his series, the Île de la Cité had changed very little from those medieval times. As seen in this photograph of the Rue des Marmoussettes, circa 1850, the streets were very narrow, which was characteristic of medieval construction. And the widest streets on the Île de la Cité measured at about 16 feet wide, and the most narrow streets were as narrow as 3 feet wide. And some of those still exist today. This was a very narrow construction, obviously, and it caused a lot of issues, including traffic flow issues And since the city's population was growing increasingly dense, especially on the Ile de la Cité, these narrow streets also had a lot, created a lot of issues, both with crime and with cleanliness. Mostly the island was home to working class people, which made it rather unappealing to middle and upper class Parisians. So unlike it is today, a very popular tourist destination, it would not have been considered safe, especially since the poor were considered to be part of les classes dangereuses, or the dangerous classes. And the Ile de la Cité came to be known as a dangerous place, especially for upstanding French citizens. In a text called The Physiology of the Parisian Quarters, published in 1841, for example, the author referred to the Ile de la Cité as ugly, misshapen, decrepit, and raggedy, and recommended that tourists skip the island altogether. The Ile de la Cité also came to be known as the locus of revolutionary activity. Another author of the period wrote that one could see gatherings of workers such as chimney sweeps and wood porters at the cafes, which he referred to as homes for rioters. But the working class way of life on the Ile de la Cité was soon to be extinguished as a vast social works program was on the horizon. This program, later called Haussmannization after its lead architect, Baron Georges-Eugène Haussmann, destroyed the medieval character of the island and forced out the working class to make room for government buildings in large squares that were meant to encourage civic duty. Napoleon III, who had recently established the French Second Empire, selected Haussmann to lead a massive urban renewal project that began in 1853 and lasted all the way until 1870. The impetus of the project was the need for modern sewers and infrastructures that would help clean up the streets of Paris and facilitate trade and traffic, but also it was a way to address revolutionary activity. As we learned when I was speaking about the Revolution of 1848, revolutionaries would exploit these narrow maze-like medieval streets of old Paris to create those barricades and render it more difficult for the military to infiltrate these working class neighborhoods. And this was something that Napoleon III wanted to make sure and address during this urban renewal project. And since the Ile de la Cité was considered a nest of criminal behavior, illness, and revolutionary activity, it's no wonder that it received one of the most major overhauls during this period. Inhabitants of the Ile de la Cité likely saw their impending doom from a mile away, and not even a mile away, really just footsteps away. On the eve of Haussmannization in 1852, Emperor Napoleon III proclaimed, quote, "Let us open new streets, make the working class quarters, which lack air and light, more healthy, and let the beneficial sunlight reach everywhere within our walls." As demonstrated by this map, entire neighborhoods were destroyed to make way for larger streets, squares, and government buildings, all of which were meant to encourage civic duty and stamp out any unsavory behavior. But as a result, upwards of 20,000 working class people were forced to leave the island, and hundreds of homes were demolished in order to bring about Haussmann's vision of this new Paris. This brings us to one of Meryon's best-known prints, which resides in the Kemper collection. Le Strige, completed in 1854, is very interesting because Meryon places the viewer inside the Notre Dame Cathedral with the Ile de la Cité stretching out before us. We are given a delightful view of the Tour de Saint-Jacques, which pierces upward in the background above the rest of the buildings. I've also included a satellite image of the Notre Dame in red in the image on the right, and the Tour de Saint-Jacques is in yellow, sort of behind Notre Dame, not on the island, but on the right bank. And this image, I hope, will kind of orient us and give us an idea of where Meryon was when he was thinking about and ideating on this print. So to achieve this scene, which features a chimera on the North Tower, Meryon would have had to be standing on the walkway between the two towers of the western facade, looking somewhat northbound. And I've denoted what I believe to be his approximate position with a little red figure in the image on the right. As demonstrated through the comparison of Meryon's etching and this photograph, taken relatively recently, but from approximately the same angle, the artist has captured an unbelievable amount of detail with incredible accuracy. So we know he was looking very closely at this edifice of the cathedral. But we also can see that he has made a few departures from reality. First and foremost, that Tour de Saint-Jacques in the background is much taller in Meryon's etching than it would have appeared in real life if one were standing on that walkway. Through this change, Meryon is able to endow this medieval monument with more agency and call more attention to its Gothic sculptural program. And in addition, it's worth noting that in one of the previous revolutions, the Tour de Saint-Jacques was attached to a church that was burnt down in one of these revolutions. So by calling more attention to that, he's also calling attention to these previous working class revolutions. So this could certainly be viewed as an act of resistance on Meryon's part, especially on the eve of Haussmannization, which fundamentally changed the purpose and appearance of the tower. As Meryon was working on this print, the Tour de Saint-Jacques was in the process of a major renovations that hadn't quite reached the Ile de la Cité at this time. Many of the buildings that had grown up around the tower, which included market stalls owned by working class people, were demolished in the 1850s. These stalls can be viewed in this woodblock print of the tower by Jacques-Benjamin Saint-Victoire from 1822, so a couple decades before Meryon was completing his print. And no doubt the demolition of the surrounding neighborhoods of the Tour Saint-Jacques would have been on Meryon's radar, since he was clearly making his way around this area of Paris on foot on a regular basis. The demolition of the area surrounding the tower can be viewed in a photograph by Edouard Baudu, taken in 1852. As seen in the photograph, the stalls that working class people would have been using to sell their produce and their goods were completely cleared out to make way for a new renovated public space, which currently surrounds the tower and can be seen in a follow-up photograph by Baudu taken in 1858. Also of note is that much of the housing around the tower has been done away with and replaced with pristine apartment buildings that are among the most recognizable vestiges of Haussmann's interventions in Paris and truly beloved today. The facades of these apartments were strictly regulated and were the same height, color, material, and general design. This architectural program provided both a monumental and harmonious effect. The Ile de la Cité went through the same kind of demolition as the Tour de Saint-Jacques, and the island was densely populated by mostly working class people. So there was sort of this replacement of this new monumental architecture and a demolition of these more anarchical maze-like working class housing buildings. As seen in L'Ostrige, Meryon dutifully documents the maze-like anarchy that I just described, this extremely eclectic amalgam of housing on the island. And if we zoom in on these structures, we can see that Meryon has purposefully shown the buildings as leaning in various directions, sinking and swelling and sort of sagging in, as if the integrity of the structure was compromised. And I've emphasized the lines, the contours of these buildings in red, so you can kind of see what I mean here. And this was not a mistake on the artist's part, however. We know that he was thoroughly capable of very detailed, oriented kind of drawing. And so as we saw even in his earlier work, that incredible naturalism has been eschewed here. And I contend that this was a conscious decision on the artist's part. In this way, Meryon was able to animate these working class apartments and in a way personify them, to activate them or give them agency per se, as if they might fight back against Haussmannization. These working class apartment buildings were completely done away with, however, just a year or two later, after Meryon completed this print, during Haussmann's renovations, as seen in these before and after photographs taken from the Notre Dame, although a different vantage point than Meryon's print, we can see the utter annihilation of these working class homes. When considering this print through the lens of Meryon's working class background and his clear admiration for these structures on the precipice of change, one begins to see L'Estrige as a criticism of Napoleon III and Haussmann's complete destruction of the Paris in which Meryon grew up, lived in, and loved. Meryon added a verse of his own creation to this print, which reads, "Insatiable vampire, internal lust, he lusts after the great Cité, his lifeblood." And although this verse has exclusively been interpreted as a romantic take on the chimera of the Notre Dame pictured in Meryon's print here, an additional reading could be applied. With the demolition of medieval Paris going on in the background, as Meryon was completing this print, one could interpret the vampire to be not the chimera, but Haussmann, and the lifeblood to be the working class of Paris, whose lives were dramatically upturned by the renovations. The buildings represented in Meryon's print were, of course, historically sacred, but to Meryon and the working class people, the people who actually lived near them and felt ownership of them, these structures were the backdrops of their lives. In this print, L'Abside de Notre-Dame de Paris, a print from the series that also resides in the Kemper's collection, Meryon shows us the working class going about their daily life, coexisting with such monumentality, with such important structures. We can see, for example, mariners loading and unloading goods, as well as boatmen floating along the Seine. Meryon repeatedly shows the working class in this series. Similar to the previous print in L'Arche de Pont Notre-Dame, Meryon gives us an even closer glimpse into the lives of the boatmen of the Seine. The artist places us at eye level with the water, as though we are the boatmen ourselves gliding with the current of the river. We get a sense for the deft skills of the workers who stand steadily in their small boats discussing with each other. One worker even scrambles up a knotted rope on the side of the bridge, an amazing feat of strength. And it's no wonder with Meryon's background in the Navy that such scenes would have enticed him. In yet another print from the series, La Morgue, Meryon shows us another aspect of working class life in which a group of men carry a corpse to the city morgue after fishing it out of the river, which you can see this little scene taking place in the lower left of the print. Above, crowds gather to take in the sight, and people peer out the windows of the buildings to observe the scene. A gendarme, who appears as a shadowy figure, as if the Grim Reaper himself, directs the men carrying the body to the morgue, while a woman and child weep to the side. Another gendarme directs away a bystander who has gotten too close. And you can kind of see that gendarme in this corridor area at the bottom of the print. At the level of the water, laundresses carry on with their day's work, cleaning clothes and linen in the very same water in which the body was floating moments ago. We can see the now clean linens hanging to dry just outside the morgue. That's sort of in the bottom right, above where the washerwomen are working. As we saw in L'Estrige, the buildings here seem to compete with one another for space. Roofs seem stacked on top of one another. Some buildings swell, other buildings sag. They take on a life of their own and a lifelike quality. They fill the scene, they take up the majority of the composition, and most of all, they bear witness to the grim scene below. And yet for these washermen in the group gathering to watch the scene, this is just another day on the Ile de la Cité. In La Rue des Mauvais Garçons, completed in 1854, Meryon documents the famous street that, translated to English, became known as Bad Boy Street. More than any other print in the series, there is a real sense of immediacy in this picture, as if completely unscripted. It seems rather casual for a bad boy street. Although the street appears well lit and seemingly harmless, the barred windows sort of provide this underlying insidious suggestion that one of the eponymous bad boys might be lurking about. The lines of the building also seem to swell, especially as space recedes. The two conspiratorial type figures on the right portion of the print seem to be in a somewhat precarious position if one imagines the structure continuing to expand itself as if to envelop these figures. I came across many tales as to why the locals dubbed this Bad Boy Street. It was something that was more of a local colloquialism, but eventually it became the official name of the street after a while. And one of the stories I came across that there was a butcher that lived here that was extremely liberal with his tools of the tools of his trade, and apparently used the knife for more than just carving up meat. But overall, it seems to have been a street associated with bandits and cutthroats, and generally a place one wouldn't want to go, especially an upstanding French citizen. At the top of the piece, Meryon has added an inscription of his own writing. What mortal lived there? Who was hidden there in this somber lair, in the night and shadows? Ah, my faith, I do not know. If you want to know, those who are curious, go see. There is yet still time. The last line of the poem, there is yet still time, seems to indicate Meryon's knowledge that the Rue des Mauvais Garçons would soon cease to exist, as the majority of the street, including this portion, would be demolished in order to extend the Rue de Rivoli, a grand boulevard built by Haussmann in 1855, the following year. Meryon's poem then has a double meaning. Given its sinister tone, the poem reads as a dare, and yet warns the reader that outsiders should beware. Only locals enter here. Yet there also is a sense that Meryon genuinely is encouraging viewers to visit this vestige of old Paris while it's still around, for as he likely knew, it would soon be turned to dust. Regardless, the print documents the infamously seedy street, memorializing yet another corner of Paris that was ultimately destroyed because it belonged to the dangerous class, the working class. The last print that I will cover in this series is especially remarkable. In Tourelle de la Tixeranderie, a mouthful, Meryon produces the image of a street that by the time he was preparing the etching had actually already been destroyed to make room for that massive boulevard, the Rue de Rivoli. Thus, everything that we see here is completely generated from Meryon's memory. Still, Meryon must have believed the little street with its tourette, this little house, to be worthy of recognition. I believe this is because of the street's history, which takes us back once more to the working class. The Tourelle de la Tixeranderie was located on the Rue de la Tixeranderie, formerly known as the Rue de la Tisseranderie, or tisser, the verb for to weave in French, where during the Middle Days, all the weavers would have worked. There were other streets for glassmakers and tanners and so on and so forth. And this one was for the weavers. Not only does the selection of this location reference the history of these weavers, but again, Meryon features several workers in the scene itself. We can see in these zoomed in images what appeared to be potentially a blacksmith working on the ground floor of the building in the left quadrant of the composition. And we can also see two men who appeared to be repairing a roof of the building in the upper right quadrant of the print. Meryon's commitment to Paris, a city that was constantly in flux, constantly changing, new visions of the city appearing, past versions disappearing, was sustained in his final active years as an artist. This print of the Louvre in the 17th century, completed in 1866, which, by the way, was the same year that he returned to the asylum and eventually died prematurely, goes to show just how far back into the past Meryon reached in his exploration, or I might even go so far as to say his excavation of the city. Documenting these histories was his life's work. The Etchings on Paris series was a compendium of memories that amounted to one final act of resistance in his life, a life that was made all the more difficult because of the stigma of his birth and of his socioeconomic status. But Meryon's print also endow the city with its own type of agency. The structures themselves partake in Meryon's active resistance. They are animated, alive, they lean in towards the viewer, they're brazen, they're proud, and they're even defiant. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions and comments now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lacy, for that wonderful look at Meryon's Prince of Paris. We do have a couple of questions coming in the Q&A, and others feel free to add questions into the Q&A feature. One question from Susan asks a little bit about what you mentioned early in your talk regarding Meryon's sort of academic training, and how, if you could share a little bit more about how he might have gotten the opportunity to train with David. These types of classes require tuition, or was it his inherent skill that impressed David, who sort of agreed to take him on?
Yeah, so it wasn't Jacques-Louis David himself. It was a student of David, a rather minor student, in fact. And what normally would have happened in the 18th century is you would have had more major artists who had studios and would have opened their studios to training, and artists in training would have potentially helped some of these artists with their compositions, which was a way for these artists to kind of get free labor and help with sometimes these enormous compositions, but also kind of pass on their skills. And so it was more informal. Art schools certainly existed and were more prevalent in the 19th century. But it appears to me that Meryon had more of this informal type of training from an already established artist. And this artist would have acted kind of as a guide. I'm not aware of any sort of fee being paid. Meryon actually met him, his teacher, because the teacher was actually also in the military. And I think Meryon happened to cross paths with him or something like that.
Thank you. Maybe a good follow-up question to that, and thinking a little bit more about the reception of Meryon's work and how his work might have been distributed or seen by the public. Meg asks a little bit about, do we know how much his prints would have been? Who would have been his intended audience? Are people able to purchase his works? And maybe also, I'm curious to sort of add on to that question, like, how would his works have been viewed by the French public? Did he participate in the salon exhibitions in the 19th century?
Yes, I believe that these prints were definitely both a way for Meryon to take on subjects that were interesting to him, that he felt close to. He was embedded in these communities, but also these kinds of images would have been really popular among the middle and upper classes, these kind of spectacular views, especially scenes like in the morgue, where you sort of have this treatment of a pretty dark subject. These kind of morbid curiosities were really big in France during the 19th century at this time. And what I really appreciate about the morgue is that he's recording these real everyday events, but not in a way that's extremely spectacularized. It's very zoomed out. He's including these events, but it's not the main focus. He's giving much more attention to the actual setting of the Seine and to the buildings that would have been lined up along it at this time on the Ile de la Cité. In terms of the cost of the prints, I'm not sure off the top of my head. But they were very popular. They did several runs, a couple of different publishers, and he also presented some of these prints at the Salon. And I think that that's where Charles Baudelaire probably first was exposed to them, and he was an art critic at the time as well. And you can really see that Meryon is playing off other contemporary interests, like in L'Estrange, you have these magnificent crows kind of flying through, and one can't really look at those and not think of Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven. And Charles Baudelaire had a translation of the works of Edgar Allan Poe at this time. We know that Meryon had read it. And so Meryon is also really thinking strategically, and he's also really aware of the market and what's going to sell. So I see him having kind of this double-sided intention where he's doing work that he really likes and resonates with him, but he also knows it's going to sell. And in fact, Haussmannization, he was aware that even though this was destroying a lot of the Paris that he knew really well, in a letter to, I believe, his father, he mentioned that, of course, he was feeling very sad about this, but he had to admit that this would increase the price and the attractiveness of these prints he was making. So he couldn't really be entirely grieving the city at the same time. So a very good businessman as well.
It's a very entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lacy. We had actually a question about the at the beginning of your talk, the portrait of Meryon by Brachmont, and the question is, did you notice that Brachmont's portrait of grotesque Meryon resembles the traditional images of Socrates? The connection between Socrates and Silenus was stressed by Rabelais in a famous passage which was widely known in France. And to sort of summarize the passage, basically, do not judge people by their appearance because they may carry in them the most amazing wisdom. Can you comment a little bit on this? And is that what Brachmont was trying to say?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Initially, when I looked at this kind of side profile and this heavy forehead, especially, I was thinking of phrenology in France in the 19th century, and this idea that the shape of your skull and your physiognomy tells a lot about your personality, your characteristics, and so on. And so I was thinking that this kind of heavy brow area, the large forehead, might have been sort of a way for him to express that he felt he was this kind of artist genius figure. But that's a really interesting connection, and I'll definitely have to think more about that. I see what you're saying now.
Another question is about the size of these prints. Were the prints very large?
No, they're rather small. I purchased a little book of them, actually. Let me find L'Estrange here. So this is a roughly the same size as L'Estrange. So that, I think, is that's something that I would have liked to have talked more about, is kind of how one experiences these prints. It's much different than a painting, right? Where you have it on a wall and you kind of are having this in-person experience, but a shared experience as well. These were very more of like a tactile experience where you're able to hold something in your hands and you can get really close to it, or you can get further away. So yeah, they're rather small prints. Yeah, these prints were rather small.
There's also a question about a specific print of La Morgue. And the question is, or there's an observation that there's black smoke pouring from the building. Were the poor denied burial space in this city and cremated?
That's interesting. I don't know the complete answer to that. Certainly pollution, just by and large, is a problem in the city at this time. It's part of kind of Paris's reputation for being a sort of a dirty, scuzzy city. Just a lot of pollution, even with these new factories and industries, a lot of pollution going into the Seine and up into the air. I'm not sure about cremation. Most of the city was Catholic, and there were Catholic cemeteries that were popularly used. In fact, one pretty close to this area on the right bank, if my memory is serving me correctly. A lot of the individuals who were pulled out of the river, however, if they weren't identified, were set on display in the morgue. And it was actually a popular pastime for people to go to the morgue and view these bodies and wonder about them. And it became kind of this bizarre, spectacular, grotesque pastime that Parisians took part in. But I'll have to look more into cremation practices. At this time, I would assume that anybody who was unidentified might have gone in an unmarked grave outside of the city. But that's really interesting. I'm not quite sure what happened to all of the bodies that would have been pulled out of the Seine, which sadly there were many.
Certainly an increased culture of spectacle in 19th century France, and interesting to think about how these spaces participate in that Meryon is documenting or capturing. There's also a question in the Q&A about the sort of political nature of these, or Meryon's involvement in politics and resistance. So the question is, you argue that representation is politics by another means. Did Meryon register any involvement with explicit forms of working class militancy and resistance?
There is quite an impressive archive of his letters that I haven't been able to completely delve through. And I can't recall at the moment coming across anything that was explicit in these letters. But I think that based on where he was living, I would say that he was at least living in very close proximity to these locations. And I think for me, the main evidence that I have at this point that he might have shared some of these working class ideals, or at least have been sympathetic, was that he left the military right after the revolution and basically threw up his hands and said, "I'm out." But that would be something really interesting to look into. And if I were to write a paper or continue with this, I really hope that I would be able to find something more explicit.
Maybe have time for one more question, which is related to the sort of literary context in which Meryon is working. So the question is, do you also analyze the literature as a document to situate Meryon's work? The issue of the representation of the sort of old Paris is complex within the literary field. And I think, Lacy, you mentioned also Victor Hugo's work. There's on the one hand a nostalgia for the old Paris, but also certainly for the politician, an awareness of the danger of these small streets, which foreshadows the sort of hygienism of Émile Zola, and the construction of parks such as the Butte Chaumont. In this context, how can one really assimilate the vampire of Notre Dame and Baron Haussmann, as you did? If you want to maybe share a little bit more about how Meryon's prints of 19th century Paris are sort of how they relate to what's taking place in the literary field at the time.
Sure. Yeah, this is a really complicated question. I would my response would be, my short response would be yes. I think that yes, hygienism was certainly an issue. There was a cholera outbreak in the 1840s that really affected the working class. A lot of the issues that Haussmannization sought to address were things that specifically affected the working class. And so it was certainly both. And the working class absolutely benefited from some of these improvements that were made to the city in terms of the sewage system, better traffic ways. There was even a cause for concern at this period of the inner city cemeteries that initially hadn't been really around these densely populated areas, but as the city was expanding at this time, people became incredibly concerned about these urban cemeteries. And so this was definitely a part of sort of this kind of shared anxiety about the city itself, its cleanliness, and the dangers associated with the city. And so I would say for Meryon, I would assume that he would have shared these types of concerns as well. That's definitely something to think about more. He was certainly well read in the avant-garde sense. He was reading Baudelaire, he was communicating with Baudelaire, he knew of Victor Hugo. I'm not sure about whether or not he was reading Emile Zola or anything like that. But he was certainly addressing the city as kind of a main character as well. So I think that there's a lot there to unpack, and that would certainly be something that merits more attention.
Thank you. Well, I think those are the perfect timing. Those are our questions really in the chat. And Lacy, I just really want to thank you for this really wonderful and rich look into Meryon's prints that we have in the Kemper's collection. Recording of this program will be available if you want to go back and look at some of these images again, or you can access them on the online collection as well. But yes, just want to thank you, Lacy, for your talk today, and also want to thank our captioner, Nilda, for providing captions for today's program. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your afternoon.